and welcome to Excel Most Valuable Functions. In this class, we will study 10 of the most popular and useful functions in Excel. We will be working with Excel 2016, but lessons learned should be consistent with most versions of Excel going back at least to Excel 2007. This class assumes a basic familiarity with the use of Excel and Microsoft Office in general, but as a quick reminder, functions are built-in tools in Excel that are used as a component of some formulas. Functions take in arguments, which is the information supplied in their parentheses, and return a value. It is worth noting that the arguments and the value can be numbers, text, dates and times, Boolean, or even blank, depending on the function. Finally, I want to be clear that the top 10 function list was determined by internet search, reading and watching Excel guides, and personal experience. The most valuable function is always the one that you need for your own work, so if you have one or more functions that were omitted here and you'd like us to include in a future video, please let us know in the comments or contact me. Now with that, let's start with function number 1, the sum, count, and average. So the most common function, and won't surprise many of you who have experience with Excel, is the sum function. But I didn't want the first one to be so basic, so I added in a couple extras here as well. I'm going to start with the chart that we see in front of us, and we're going to do an example of using the sum function to get a total number of sales. Now, in case you're not familiar with this one, the sum function adds a group of numbers together and returns its value. You can do it by listing the numbers in the arguments, or you can create a range. I will demonstrate on the screen now. Whenever we're typing in functions, as I mentioned before, we assume a basic familiarity with Excel, but I'll just do the demonstration with this one. We begin with the equal sign, we type the name of the function, and then we put the arguments in parentheses. Now, with newer versions of Excel, and by newer I mean in the last 10 to 15 years, when you type in the parentheses, it will show you the function and will suggest the arguments that you want to enter in. In this case, we want to enter in the cell range B2 through B7. So I put in B2, B7. When you do ranges like this, it is inclusive of the first and last item. So it's not everything between B2 and B7, it includes B2 and B7. If we were so inclined, we could add more numbers in here. This is treated as one number being put in, this range that we put in, by putting in a comma and typing in, say, another range like C2 through C7. Which is not appropriate here because there's nothing in it. Or we could put in individual numbers or actual numbers. Oops. And that would work as well. But in this case, we just want B2 through B7. Now when I type that and I press enter, I get the result. If you highlight the cell again, you can see the function listed above there. But you see, that is the sum function. If you've worked with Excel much, you've probably used the sum function before. It is by a wide range the most common function that is used. I did want to show some related ones here as well that we'll knock out really quickly. I type equals count and then in parentheses, the same range. Now you might think, well, you know the numbers that you're typing in. You're typing B2 through B7. It's pretty easy to figure out how many things there are there. In this case, yes. But if you were looking at a more complicated thing, say you had many rows up and down and many columns left and right, and you wanted to count all the individual items in hundreds of rows down and dozens of rows to the side, then that count function might be a little bit more useful. In this case, it's not going to be too illuminating. It's just going to tell us, yes, there are 6 items there. But there are times when the count function is appropriate, and there are also times where you use it as part of a larger formula, where you need to get the number of items that are in there because you need to enter that into another part of a formula that you have going together. So we will sometimes use that function in the middle of a more complex formula just to be able to calculate the number of items that we were working with. And then finally, I'll show you the average. You might have noticed as I'm typing these that a lot of suggestions come up. These are formulas that have the same letters that I've typed in before. These are, built-in functions that we have here. And some of these you will see later in the class. We'll be talking about the if functions as we come to a later section of the class. But if you're ever unsure of the spelling, that can be helpful. Now I'll put in the same range that we did before here. And that gives us our average sales. So that is our first function. Again, the most common functions that you're likely to use, you've probably used already if you've used Excel very much. And I hope that that was clear. We're going to move on and get slightly more complicated as we go. For our second most valuable function, we're going to talk about concatenate. Concatenate is a function that we use with text. It's similar to addition in that we are connecting multiple cells, but of course we're working with text functions. And so that gives us a little more detail that we have to work out. Now I'm going to show you two different ways to use this function. The first one we will do by typing it in. Now, the example that I have here, I'm going to show you how to take three different parts of text, three different cells with text in them, and string them together into one cell. And we'll do this in a couple of different ways. First, I'll simply type equals concatenate, and you see it helps me spell it out there, which is useful with the longer ones. And then in parentheses, for the arguments, it wants text1, text2, and so on. Very similar to the sum function, but this time we're looking for text instead of a number. Now, I'm going to start out with a very basic way of doing this. I'm going to type A2, comma, B2, comma, C2. We're going to clean this up and make it look a lot nicer in just a moment, but I just want to show you the basic way of entering these things in. I press enter, and we get the result of one value here with all three of them strung together. Now again, you might say, well, I could have just read that right there. That's not very readable. But imagine situations where you needed to pull information from lots of different worksheets or even workbooks and put them together in one place so that you could have consolidated records or easily searchable things so you could find what you wanted. You can see how this might be useful. Now, before we go into it in more detail, I do want to show you another way to use concatenate. So I'm going to delete this, and I'll show you that you can simply type, just like if we were adding numbers together, we can use the plus symbol. We can use the ampersand symbol here, and that works just like the concatenate function. Just wanted to show you that shortcut. For the rest of the exercise, I'm going to type out the entirety of the function because I want to be consistent with everything else that we're doing today. But just be aware that you have that option of using ampersand to tie together strings of text. Now, before, when we had this typed out, we had A2, comma, because we're using commas to separate different arguments that we put in here, B2, comma, C2, and we got that result. But what if we wanted this to look more like somebody's actual name when they enter it in? Well, first things first, we would change C2 and B2, so the middle initial is in the middle there. But let's remember what we did with the sum function, how I was showing you that you could add in actual numbers, static data, just typing in the number 150 or whatever was appropriate to put in, and that would work as well. The same is true with text. So we can put in static text here if we want. We can put in things like a space. And you notice that I have a comma in between that because this little space here in the quotation marks is one of the text arguments, and so that needs a comma between it just like everything else. And then maybe after the middle initial, I could put in period space. Whoops, so it looks more like an initial. Now we can say, oh, that's looking nicer there. So that's getting to be a little bit more realistic looking. And we could keep it like that, or if we wanted to, maybe we would change this around. Whoops, little typos. I could get rid of the space at the end, and I could do last name, comma, space, first name, and then middle initial. Whoops. You can see I got the wrong cell there. There, I correct that. So now it's Rockefeller, comma, John D. So if you wanted to have people sorted by last name, you could do it that way. Now, we haven't done a demonstration of this yet, but when you're working with functions, just like any other formula, we can copy and paste them quickly using the corner black square drag down here. And I can see that effect with everybody that I put in. So, again, the concatenate, once you get the hang of it, fairly straightforward function, but very useful for grabbing text from different cells or even different worksheets or different files and squeezing it together into one cell so you can have everything in one place and perhaps sort it there or organize it or use it however you like. So that's our function number 2. Now I'm going to go right into function number 3 because it's very similar. Function number 3 is the right, left, and mid functions. These are ones that you would use to grab text from something, either on the left-hand side of it or the right-hand side of it, and go from there. Now, let's take a look at the worksheet that I had here just a moment ago. This is something that we had here in function 2, and I'm going to show you how you can use the right, left, and mid functions to grab individual characters from each thing. So remember our formula that we wrote a moment ago with concatenate. In parentheses here, we had the last name, so that was B2, comma, space. Then we had the first name, that was A2, then a space. Then we had the middle initial, which was C2, oops, and then a period. What if I wanted to change that I only wanted the first initial? I didn't want the entire first name. What we can do instead of A2 is we can do the left function, and then in parentheses, we give it A2, and then it says number of characters. Everybody see that? So we have, this is an example of a nested function. So we were taking a function and we were putting it inside of another function. And so we were putting the left function as one of the arguments here, and we were giving it A2, which is the first name, and then we were going to tell it one character, and close parentheses. Now when I press enter, Rockefeller, JD. And I could clean that up a little bit and put a period in there. So now it's Rockefeller, comma, J.D. And I could do the same thing if I wanted with the last initial. I could change that instead of being B2 to being left and taking one character and going that way. And of course I can copy and paste this on down. Let me give you a quick example of when you might use the right side. So we might think, okay, I could see using the left side if you want to grab the initials or the first couple letters off something for sorting reasons. That could be useful. When would you grab the last couple of letters? Well, very often you wouldn't. But sometimes what you would do with this is you would use the right function if you are, say, working with phone numbers or IDs or in some way. And you might use the left for phone numbers as well. If we had had phone numbers in here and everybody had entered in phone numbers, just making up some phone numbers as we go here, and you wanted to pull out the area code, we would first have to change all of this formatting by going into the number and saying that it is text. What you do with this, if you haven't worked with number formatting before, in the formatting section for numbers, you can change them to be whatever kind of number you want. Are you working with dates and times? Are you working with currency? In this case, we were changing it to text because we don't want to treat it as numbers. If you think of a phone number or a zip code or a social security number, you're not adding or subtracting things to them. They are in fact text strings that are just done with numbers for sorting purposes. So we will change these to text, and then we can use the equals left for D2 and pull the first three characters out, and then you can get area codes, and you could sort all of these by area codes. But you could also get the last four if you wanted to organize things that way. Very often when you work with stores, they will use your phone number as an indexer for your account. They will be able to look you up by phone number, and usually they are just grabbing the last few numbers. So when they sort things through, they might be pulling these numbers out. Here at the library, if you have a library card, you might be able to look down at it now and see that we have a 14-digit library card number underneath it. I'll let you in on a little secret. The first 8 of those numbers are exactly the same for everybody. And so when we are pulling information out for people, we just look at the last 6 of their numbers for sorting reasons. And so we would grab the right 6 numbers for that if we were going through it that way. Things like that, situations where you want to grab the end of a string of text, you might want to use the right. In my experience, I use the left function more often than the right function, but you do have that option. And the mid function grabs from the middle of the text as you go. So those functions 2 and function 3 work with text. I want to show you those both together because they are very similar. Now let's go on to function 4. For our fourth most valuable function, I'm going to combine a couple of them for you again, as these two came up together in a lot of lists. And I'm going to show you, again, working with text, the trim and the len functions. The trim function allows you to clean up data that is entered into a spreadsheet. Now, I artificially made this kind of sloppy here, typing it in, but those of you who have worked with Excel, and in particular who have worked with Excel spreadsheets that lots of different people use, probably have experience seeing that these things can get to be kind of messy kind of fast. People put things in different formats, they copy and paste them from different places, and you can get lots of blank spaces or enter lines pressed in, things like that. And so the trim function quickly removes blank space. Now you can see I just entered in some basic information here. This could be any text that you put in. All we need to do is enter in the equals trim, and then in parentheses you tell it what text to fix. So I tell it B2, and I press enter, and it got rid of all those dead spaces. And now I can copy and paste this on down, and you see it cleaned up those next 2 lines as well. I'm going to widen this out a little bit here. Now I do want to show you the len function. This is another one that is often associated with it. What this function is doing is it is counting the numbers of characters in any given cell. So this could be numbers, dates, text, any cell that you want to check. This tells you how many characters are in it. When I do this, I say equals len, and this is a good demonstration of how the trim function works, because if I do len for B2 and copy that down, you see it's 9, and then I go down to the next one, it's 51 characters. The next one is 46. But what if I change that to the trimmed version of it? If I change that from B2 to G2, that went from 9 to 6, from 51 down to 40, and from 46 down to 33. And over time, and with larger spreadsheets that have lots and lots of data in them, those space savings can add up. So it can not only clean things up, but it can also make things use less storage, depending on how you have the files organized. So a couple of quick functions, fairly easy to use there, but worthwhile to know that they exist. The trim function is actually one that I wasn't aware of before I started this exercise going through these lists. The len function is one that I've used for calculating the size of things to use for the left and right functions in the past. So you can use that as a way of figuring out where you want to go with left and right. You can use the len to calculate the number of spaces that you're using. So that is a useful one with that, not just for informational purposes, but for using as part of other functions that are built in. So again, the nested functions inside of a formula. So that's function 4. Now function 5, I'm going to show you the max and min functions. These are another popular pair that often go together for obvious reasons. The max function will tell you the largest number in a range of cells, and the min function will tell you the smallest number in a range of cells. You can use this in a lot of different ways. I'm doing a very basic example of it here. I have about 800 numbers going down here in the sales, and I want to know the maximum or minimum. Now, you might want to do this in a more complicated setup if you're trying to find ranges for invoices that you have outstanding and find the most important ones to pay, whatever it might be. A lot of uses for this, but I'm just doing a quick demonstration. So I'll type in equals max, and then I put in the number range. So I'd say A2 through A799. And that tells me that 998 is the maximum number that I have in that range. And the minimum will work the same way, equals min, in parentheses, A2 through 799. Oops, A799. Easy mistake there, and someone that you always want to watch out for with typos. You have to do the correct cell reference. People make that mistake all the time. Then when I press enter, it tells me the minimum number is 0, and you might have noticed that the maximum number is 997. In fact, the eagle-eyed watchers here might have noticed that these numbers were changing every time I went through. Give you a little bonus function built in here. I was not terribly inclined to type in 800 numbers for this. So what I did is I wrote a function to randomly generate a number. We're going to see this integer function a little bit later on in our list. That was a very commonly used one in the top 10 list that I went through. But this rand function that we see nested in the middle here, this generates a random number between 0 and 1. And so when you multiply it by 1,000, it generates a random number between 0 and 1,000. And so I used that to create a bunch of random numbers here so that we could get a maximum and minimum for them. However, every time you enter something in, it recalculates these. So when I typed in those formulas, it recalculated all of these random numbers all the way on down. So a little bonus for you there. Rand is not something that is super commonly used, so that would not find its way onto any top 10 lists, but it's useful for when you need to just toss in numbers into something to test it out. I've done that when testing, probability and investment spreadsheets, things like that. You just want to throw numbers into them, and the random function can be helpful. And since you normally want a random number that is not just between 0 and 1, knowing to multiply it by a number gives you a more broad range. So if I wanted a number between 0 and 10, I would multiply it by 10 instead of 1,000. If I wanted it between 0 and 50, you get the idea. You multiply it by the number you want to get the random range in between. So those are our fourth and fifth functions. Relatively easy to use, but worth knowing that they're there. That we again had the trim and len and the max and min as those functions. So let's move on to getting to some more complicated functions as we go. That brings us to function 6. I am again including a couple of functions to squeeze a little bit more into this. I'm going to show you the sumif and the countif functions. These are some basic logical functions that allow Excel to do a test, and based on that test to perform a different task. So what I've done here is I've taken the initial sales spreadsheet that we had in function 1, and I've added a lot more entries. This is still a relatively small spreadsheet. In real life, you would have many, many more lines most of the time. And the if functions that we're going to demonstrate here are a great way to sift through a lot of data and pull out certain numbers. So say I wanted, in this example, Bob's sales. I could read through here and I could find, okay, there's 167 there and 584 there. And I could scroll through and have my eyes burn and probably end up missing something. Yep, I skipped over the 222 there. Or I can have Excel do this for me. And I do this with the sumif function. So I again begin with the equal sign. I type sum if, and then in parentheses, it has the range. Now this is the first place where people typically make a mistake with this function. You don't want the range of things you're going to be adding in. You want the range that you are testing. So here I would type A2 through A25, because that, I believe, is how many cells I'm checking. Yes. Then the criteria has to match the word Bob. So you put in quotes the word Bob, because it is text that you are comparing. You put it in quotation marks. If it was a number value, you'd simply type in the number. If you're looking for with an equal sign, if you're looking for greater than or less than, you'd use the greater than or less than symbols. Now, do a comma, and then we do the sum range. So this is the range of numbers that you would add together. So if it matches the criteria, do you add it together? And so we type in B2 colon B25. Oops, 25. And then once we've done that, we press enter, and it gives us 1357, which if we go through here and we highlight all of the ones from Bob, I believe we will find that that number is correct. Yes, you see I highlighted all 4 of those, and I get the sum is 1357. Now, if there were 10,000 lines here and lots of different things to look through, then that would be hard to do. And you might think that that sounds like an impossibly large spreadsheet. Maybe you're thinking, I use Excel at home. What would I need to be looking through really large files? I can give you a personal example. For many years, I used Excel to keep track of my checkbook. I no longer do that. I found different methods for it, but that was something that I found useful for a long time. And as every entry into the checkbook added another row to it, after 5, 6, 7 years of doing so, it started to get to be a very long spreadsheet. But I still would want to pull out archive data if I wanted to compare, say, NICOR bills, if they're changing over time, or ComEd, or anything like that. And I would use the sumif functions to be able to average things over time. So instead of having to look through months and months and months and pull out the one time every month I wrote a check to Nicor, I would use the sumif, and it would go through and it would scan and it would grab everything that matched for that. Now, the one thing that you need to be careful of with these is that computers are not good at getting what you mean. So if I had made a typo here and put in 2Bs, then all of a sudden that number drops down because I made a little typing mistake there. Luckily, it doesn't care about capitalization, so we can do the lowercase bob, and that works. But if you typed bib instead of bob or any other mistakes, you run into trouble. So you want to be very careful if you're using this to make sure that you use a consistent value in the area that you're doing with the criteria. So you don't want to be casual about what you type in there. And if you're wondering how many entries there are for something, maybe you wanted to calculate an average, but well, the average if is a function that you could use as well. So, but that one's not on the list that we had here. But if you wanted to get a quick count of them, we do have a countif function as well that I would like to show you. The countif function is a little simpler because it doesn't have a range for summing things up. It just wants a criteria to test and a range to test it. So in the range, we type again A2 through A25. And for the criteria, we again type in Bob. And then it tells us there are 4 of those, 4 entries in there. So if you're wondering how many of them there are, maybe as a way to test to see if you forgot to enter in a month or something along those lines, you could do that really quick to count up how many entries you put in and make sure it's the right number for everybody. So I could check Bob, and then I could go back and say, check Joe, and so on through all the names, and make sure that they are all the same numbers that I've entered in everybody's months correctly. It's ways of double checking yourself and making sure that the numbers are working. So that's the countif and the sumif functions. Again, these are logical tests that you're having Excel do. So it's a little bit more than you simply telling it, hey, add together all those numbers. You're telling it, hey, go check this cell range, and every time that this comes up, then add in the number. So you're adding complexity there. Now, the next one that I want to show you seems like it would be similar, but it actually serves a different purpose. And this is the if-error function. So we're going to go to function 7, and I'm going to show you the if-error function. Now, to do this, I first want to show you just typing in a basic formula that you'd probably be familiar with. Say I wanted to figure out how many sales people were making per year. And so I could type in the number of years here, or as is often the case, in my experience at least, I very often prepare the structure for a spreadsheet before the data is entered in. So maybe you're giving this to other people to do the data entry, or maybe you're just getting everything in place and then you're going to come along later and enter the data as it is given to you. Either way, very often we write the formulas before we have the data there. And so sometimes when you do that, you will get an error message because the data is not in place. So if I were to say, okay, sales per year equals the sales, which is B2, divided by the years, which is C2, that gives me a divide by 0 error. Did I make a mistake? No, I didn't do anything wrong there. That is the correct formula. That's how this would work. There are simply no years entered in there. So I press the number 3, and now all of a sudden it works. But while this might be just fine for your own spreadsheet, if you know you did everything right, maybe you need to hand this to other people and they would be confused or concerned by the error message. Maybe you just don't like how it looks kind of sloppy there. And so there are ways to handle this differently. So this is where things like the if error value comes in. What this does is it checks, and if there is an error in it, it returns a different value instead. Let me demonstrate. So I would do in parentheses if error, then in parentheses there. So the value should be B2 divided by C2. That's what we want it to be. But if there is an error, we'll just have it come out as 0 as a placeholder. So I press enter there, and there's the 0, and then once I type in the number of years, there it goes. And so when I copy this on down, you get the zeros all the way through there, and then when I type in the years, it fills in the numbers as we go. So that can be, again, a handy little function for keeping things clean in your spreadsheets and preventing errors from appearing. You could also have something in here that gave a message so that it was an indicator to you that something went wrong. So in this case, we used this as a way of avoiding having an error message pop up. But if we wanted to have this let you know that an error meant that something had been missed, you could put in a message to indicate that as well. So those are the 6th and 7th functions. Let's continue on to function number 8. The two functions that I want to demonstrate as for the function number 8 on the Excel MVP, yes, I keep squeezing extras in here because I find them to be similar to each other and I want to give you guys a little bit extra, are the integer function and the proper function. Now, we saw the integer function a little bit earlier and I glossed over it and I said we'd come back to that later on. And both of these go together because they're both ways of cleaning up information that is either entered in or calculated within your spreadsheets. So looking at the integer function, I think the easiest way to demonstrate what this does is with an example. So I grabbed a chunk of those random numbers that I had before, and I'm showing you how this works with and without the integer. Now I'll first explain what the integer function is. It is taking a argument that is entered into it, which is any number that can be entered into it, and it is creating an integer, which is essentially a counting number. This is 0, 1, 2, 3 onto infinity large numbers, but they're all counting numbers, solid numbers, non-decimals, non-fractions, not negative numbers. They're just counted up. And so you see, with the randomization, with the integer around this, it takes this random number, and instead of giving you a long string of numbers, it gives you an actual integer, the 30, 994, whatever it might be. And if we look at the random number here without the integer, we get this long string that is kind of a mess and hard to look at or hard to calculate. You could do things with formatting for this, that you could cut out the decimal places, but for the most part, the integer is a nice way to control this. Another example we could use for this is we could put around this value in here for the calculation, we could put integer, and that way it would give us a round number for the sales per year instead of those long strings there. So we can use integers in places where we don't need to be exact. We're not calculating precise measurements. We just want to have a number to work off of. You might be familiar with this if you've filled out your taxes using anything online like H&R Block. You enter in, calculated number with cents in it, and it just cuts it down to the integer straight away. So you've probably seen this before with things like that. So that's the integer function. It's again just a way of cleaning up the numbers so it's something that's easier to work with. The proper function is similar, but it works with text. Again, if you allow people to do data entry or you create forms that people can submit information to and it goes straight to an Excel spreadsheet, then you've probably seen some messy data entered into your spreadsheet. It happens to everybody all the time. I gave examples here of, oops, we had the caps lock on and we had a full thing typed in caps, somebody that doesn't enter in capital letters at all, or somebody that holds down the shift key a little bit too long at the start. Whatever the mistake can be, proper gives you proper capitalization for information that's entered in. So if I type in this function and then I say F4, it corrects that. And then I can copy this on down for however many there are, and it corrects all of them as we go. So with that, we can clean up our text that has been entered in as well. So those are two, again, relatively easy to use functions once you know that they're there. The arguments aren't that complicated, not that hard to work with, but it's important to be aware of them and be ready to go there. So let's go on to function number 9. Okay, for function number 9, I've got a couple interesting ones for you. These allow you to calculate the days between two dates. I'm doing an example here again with my imaginary salespeople, and I'm finding the number of days employed and also the number of days worked, because they're two different functions. One of them is the days function. I'll demonstrate that first. And then the other one is the network days function, which allows you to calculate work days. So it excludes weekends, and if you like, you can alternatively put in holidays. Now, to do this, it's important to get the formatting right. I think we can imagine scenarios where this could be useful if you wanted to, again, calculate averages over a number of days, if you wanted to see how long somebody has been somewhere, if you want to figure out how many days they were left in the school year, if you have any kids that are very eager to know that. A lot of situations where you could pull this up, but we want to make sure that we get the typing right. And so we're going to start out with the days function. I'm going to say equals days, and then in parentheses, and here's a key one, and this is a mistake that I've personally made a couple of times, it says end date and then start date. That's a little backwards, right? Normally we would go with the start first and then the end. If you do that, if you go start first and then end, it will give you a negative number, if it works at all. So you want to make sure that you do the end date first. In this case, that is F2. And then the start date, which in this case is E2. And I close the parentheses, and it says that Bob has been there, or will, as of December 15th of this year, have been there 7,806 days. I can copy this on down, and I can see the days range for everybody. And even if I know my brain certainly can't calculate 21 years worth of days very quickly, but I can look down and see Clarice has been there just under a year, and yep, 329 seems about right. Now, days worked is calculating on a basic 5-day work week, and for that, we use the network days. Whoops. Now, in the arguments, this is interesting. For one, they trick you up by going with the start date first this time. So we're going to do E2, then the end date, F2. Now, this is the interesting part. You have an optional argument here for holidays, and you notice how it's in a bracket. We haven't done this yet. That's part of the reason I wanted to demonstrate this function, is that that bracket indicates an array. And so an array of data is a group of cells. It can be a very large group. It can be a relatively small group. In this case, I did a relatively small group. And in this bracket, you are indicating which days are holidays. So whether they are weekends or not, they are non-working days and they are taken off of the list. So it's going to count up how many holidays are in the range for these people. Now, I am not going to include this at first, and then we're going to go back and add it so we can see the difference. So I do parentheses here, and so this is counting up the network days. So it should be about 5/7 of the total that we have here. And yep, that worked more or less right. And we copy that down, and we can see this calculation go all the way across. Now, I'm going to go back up and add in the holidays. But to do that, I want to show you what I did. If you're not familiar with naming cells or ranges, if you highlight any cell, it already has a name. You can see this name in the upper left-hand corner here. You see it says G7. That's the name box. You see that appear when my mouse hovers over there. And the G7 comes from the column and the row number. But you can give things specific names if you want. So I could highlight this cell, and instead of it being called A6, I could call it Clarice. There's no real reason to do that here, but you can if you wanted to. And then in any other space in this worksheet or any worksheet in this file, we could refer to the cell Clarice, and it would know that it was there. You can also do this for a range of cells, which I did when I highlighted all of these holidays that I had entered in here, and I named them holidays. Now, unfortunately, if I wanted this to work properly, I would have to go in and I would have to add these holidays for every year, and then it would get the range properly going back a long ways. I didn't want to do that. I was just doing a quick demonstration here. So I highlighted these three, and I gave it the range name holidays for that in the name box. So when I go here and I type this in, instead of having to put in a range of cells, I can type holidays. And you'll see this goes from 5577 to 5574 because all three of those days are in that range. And I'll copy that down. 27, 19, 31. Now you see that one did not change because she did not work through those dates. So that remained the same and unaffected by the change. And then finally, Edward goes down 3. So you see that worked properly because it did not recalculate the holidays for her, which I specifically put outside of that range. So if you want to be really precise with the number of days left or the number of days worked, you can put in all of the days when they would not have come in. You could add other complications to this if you wanted to, but it's a really nice way of figuring out date ranges, which can be a complicated thing to do. Both just the basic, how many actual days are there between one date and another, and how many work or school days are there using the network days, as we have here. So those are some date functions, which we haven't worked with before. And finally, that brings us to function number 10, which will be a familiar one to a lot of you, but we're going to take some time with it because it is a very important function. And finally, when we arrive on function number 10, we weren't going to miss this one, vlookup. This is a very popular function, definitely one that you want to be familiar with if you're looking for work in Excel. It's used in a lot of different situations. The purpose of vlookup is you take one bit of information that's part of a table or an array of cells, and using that information, you pull other bits of data from that array, or from that table that you've seen. So in this example, we're going to have a form where whoever was filling out the form is able to enter in a salesperson's ID and pull a lot of data about them automatically. So if I go to the Employees tab that I've created here, you can see we have an ID number for all of our imaginary employees. We have their name, sales, years worked, sales per year, hire date, termination date, all that information that we've seen before. But what we're going to do is we're going to set this up so that whenever somebody uses this form and they enter in an ID, they can have more data just appear automatically here, so they don't need to type in somebody's name and other relevant data as they go. And we do that with vlookup. Now, I am going to not fill in a formula using that function vlookup in the salesperson ID, because that's where we're going to be entering in data. I am going to fill it in for the next three underneath that we're going to have automatically fill this. And I'm using this as an HR tool. You could use this as part of an invoice if you have services that you provide where you could just type in the number for that service and it automatically fill in the cost and description and the employees who do it. You could use this as something that worked off of SKU codes for items that you sell, where you enter in that number and things automatically fill in. In fact, this is how most stores work. When they use a barcode scanner and they scan the barcode on the shirt that you're buying, it fills in all the details because it's pulling off of that key that has been entered in. Now, it might not be using Excel. It's probably using a different formula that's specific to that company, but it's the same idea that you're giving it some information and it pulls the rest of the information with that. So lots of different possibilities here. Now I will begin by typing in equals vlookup. And then in parentheses, we're going to enter in the arguments. Now the lookup value is going to be what I type in for the initial search. That's going to be B4 because that's where I'm entering in the salesperson ID. The table array is that information that I showed you a moment ago. I could type this from memory, but I trust myself more if I click on it with my mouse and drag across like so. After that, I'll put in the column index number. That is, which column do you want to return? So in this case, I want the name, so I want the second column. You see they count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. You want the second column, so I put in a 2. And then finally, it asks, do you want approximate matches? So do you want something that's close to what you typed in? Generally speaking, the answer to this is false. The only time that you would want approximate matches if you were looking for a range of things, maybe a range of costs or a range of percentages done on performance of a test given, something like that. But if you want to match an ID number or an invoice number or a barcode number or anything specific, you're going to want to say false, that you want exact matches only. So I do that. And what do we have? We have an error because nothing has been entered in here. So if you're looking for a little extra practice on your own, I'd encourage you to recreate this at home with the if error protection around this so that you don't get that result. But now when I come here and I type in an ID number, it changes to Clarice. And now I can do this again. In parentheses, lookup value is again B4. Table array, we again go to employees. There. In this case, I believe it was years worked, so that would be the fourth column. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4. So that's what we want returned. And then again, false. I got it wrong, sales per year. So we go back to here and we see sales per year is in the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5th column. So I'll go back here and I make a correction to that. In my experience, the column index number can be the most confusing part for people. Just remember that you have a lot of data that is attached to this ID, and you have to choose which part of that data you want to return in this specific cell. That's why we have an almost identical formula over and over again, but we are changing up the column index number because we want different data back. So in this case, years worked, that's where we did the VLOOKUP in parentheses. B4, table array is employees, A2 through G7, column index number is 4, and false. And so we see Clarice has worked 1 year, had 397 sales per year, and then you would type in the description of what happened there. And I could change the ID number. So you might think, oh, that was a lot of work. Couldn't I have just gotten the information? Yes. If you're doing this just once, it would be faster to just look up the information. But once you have created this form, now I can just type in whatever ID number I want, and it pulls in all the information. And we could have this be as long and as elaborate as we wanted. If the employee information contained a category for first name and last name and middle initial, you could use some of the other tricks that we learned earlier to concatenate all of those together or pull out whatever information you wanted. Lots of things that you can do with this once you have the structure in place. And then as you change the information, it adjusts everything accordingly. So again, a little bit of work, a little bit of overhead at the start to create this and put this into place. But once you have it, really useful tool. VLOOKUP is something that is very commonly asked for. In fact, so commonly asked for that we have an entire class about it here. If you want to look through our archive of old classes, we have an entire class learning about how to use VLOOKUP because it is a very popular one and we get a lot of questions about it. But I would encourage you to play around with all of these. This spreadsheet in completed form will be available on our website for download. If you go to the mybpl.org website, you can go to our computer classes and you can download the file there. And so you can play around with this on your own at home if you have Excel. With that, I hope you found these helpful. I would love to hear about it. If there's any other functions that you want us to talk about, if you want to do a next top 10 list and you have anything in mind, we're happy to add more and talk about more details. Thank you very much and have a great day.